Okay, well, today we are going to be talking about the church in the East. Before we really get to focus in on the church in the East, though, we're going to have to talk about the unified church in the 5th and 6th centuries. Then we're going to focus in on the East. We're just going to have one more class period. Next class, we're going to be trying to wrap all this up. It's been a long journey, and I hope you've stayed with me, and I hope this has been good and useful to you. Again, I just want to reemphasize once again, I am not an expert in this in any shape or form. And so this has been as much for me as it has been for you. And so I hope you've gotten something out of it. I know that I have, just trying to systemize and organize all of this info in my brain. Flip to the back. We're going to talk about some terms that are going to get confusing because they sound very, very similar. But they mean very similar things in some cases, but have very, very slight definitional differences. So we're going to talk about diophysitism a little bit today. We talked about this a little bit, although we didn't use this term when we talked about the Christological controversies, especially concerning Chalcedon. What Chalcedon essentially does is it asserts diophysitism, which means two natures. Two, physitism is the word nature. And so it's the idea that there's two natures in Christ. The opposing view to that, which Eutyches was espousing, is sometimes called monophysitism. And you might see the word mono there and see the word one. And so what this teaches is that Jesus had one nature, and that nature is, depending on who you ask, where you fall on the spectrum, either a divine nature or a synthesis of a divine human nature, some kind of combination of the two. But rather than two natures, he has one nature. Then there's we're going to talk about a in-between position here, kind of a moderating position, which has been sometimes labeled monophysitism, but that's a bad label, and they would reject it. It's sometimes called miaphysitism or hinophysitism. Those are the same, talking about the same thing. You can use them interchangeably, really. But miaphysitism is the thought that there's one nature, one unified nature, but that unified nature is both divine and human. So it's not either or, but it's both. And so it's kind of a middle ground position. And we're going to talk, there's several churches that still hold to this. So then we're going to talk a little bit after that about monothelitism, which sounds very similar, but is something different, which is the idea that there's one will in God or in Jesus. And so Jesus has two natures, divine, human, but he has one will, which corresponds with the one person. Then you're also going to have, in juxtaposition to that, diothelitism, just to make things nice and confusing, which is the teaching that Jesus has two wills, which correspond to his two natures, a divine will and a human will, and the human will is in subjection to or submission to the divine will. We're not going to talk about it in huge detail, but those are some terms that are going to come up, and I know they're really confusing, and they sound very similar. So if you get confused, just flip in the back, and you can see those. So as we get going, let's talk about the eras of the church. Because from this point on up to the 6th century, which we're going to cover briefly, and then we're going to talk about the separate churches in of themselves, the Eastern Church and the Western Church, there really becomes a distinction. You just have to talk about them separately. In the 1st century, you have what some have dubbed the Apostolic Church, the Church of the Apostles. The apostles are still alive and active and going about their ministries. 2nd century has sometimes been called the early Catholic Church, Catholic meaning universal. Those are the Apostolic Fathers that we talked about. That's really where we began our series. 3rd century, you have sometimes called the Old Catholic Church. Christianity is still not legalized in the 2nd century. The changes in the 4th century, the big shift is that Christianity becomes legal, and not only legal, it becomes mandatory. And so now you have this kind of merger of church and state that's going to exist for basically forever. Then in the 5th century, you begin to have cracks in the unified church, and you have really the emergence of the Roman Catholic Church. And so we talked about Pope Leo I being the real first capital C Pope, or capital P Pope of the capital C Catholic Church. And so that happens in the 4th century or 5th century with Chalcedon. And then in the 6th century, really the Eastern Church kind of comes into its own and is the Byzantine Catholic, or really becomes what's going to be called the Orthodox Church. And even today, we kind of use these classifications. We talk about the Roman Catholic Church, which is existent, alive, and well today. And we also talk about the Orthodox Church. When we talk about the Orthodox Church, we may be talking about a whole host of different, denominations, perhaps, churches with different names and things, but they all follow orthodoxy, that Eastern idea. So let's talk about 5th and 6th century for a couple minutes. So immediately after Chalcedon, you begin to have discontent once again. Chalcedon really affirms Diophysitism. The Chalcedonian Creed makes it very clear that you have one person with two distinct natures. It talks about them being without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. And that's very, very clear in the language of Chalcedon. And Chalcedon takes place 451. You have, immediately following that, a lot of discontent, though. Chalcedon relied heavily on the work of, you had this back and forth between the Alexandrians, the Antiochians, and there's this kind of tug of war going on for influence. The Nestorians are condemned, then the Eutychians are condemned, and there's this back and forth tension mostly among Eastern churches, but it also impacts the Western church between these different groups. And so in the aftermath of Chalcedon, which really affirms that the two natures, Cyril, who we've talked about previously, his followers that lean more towards that one nature aspect, they're very discontent. They think that Chalcedon sounds Nestorian. Nestorius took the idea that there were essentially two different Christs. There was the Son of David, and then there was the Son of God, and that they were two humans, two separate beings. It took that to an extreme. And so those critics of Chalcedon who see that type of language talking about two natures, they see it and they say, that sounds like Nestorianism, which we have condemned. And so you have an emerging group that begin to call themselves, monophysitism, monophysites. And so you can break that down. Mono meaning one, physite meaning nature. The term mono here, there's a couple of different words for one in Greek, and we'll talk about this briefly in a minute. But the word mono carries with it the implication not just of one, but of onlyness. And so these are people who are going to take the position that at the incarnation, the divine nature is absorbed. The divine nature absorbs, rather, the human nature, or perhaps mingles with the human nature and mixes and leaves you some kind of mixture of the two. But the end product of the incarnation is that you're left with a Jesus who has one nature. The other nature has faded away. And so it's either entirely divine or it's, some kind of amalgamation, mixture of the two. This is what Eutychius was teaching, right? He was teaching that you have this, the divine nature overwhelms and overcomes the human nature. And so that Jesus was fully divine. And he really struggled to explain the humanity of Jesus and the manhood of Jesus. And so that's always been the problem with this, is how can we say that there's one nature, that Jesus is divine, and yet still continue to affirm his humanity, because his humanity is essential. That which is not assumed is not saved. And so this is a position that is extreme. These are two extreme sides. You have a mediating position that appears, miaphysitism or henophysitism. And here you have another word that means one, but this version of the word one does not imply the idea of onlyness. And so this is the term that people who still hold this today, this is the term that they prefer. Sometimes they're labeled mono, and they reject that because of the implications. But the Miaphysitites will say that Eutychianism is wrong, that the Chalcedonian Diophysitism is wrong, and you need to take a position that says there are two natures of Jesus, yes, but they are totally unified without mixing and mingling. That's a very convoluted, and when you think about it, there's really not much of a difference, perhaps a vocabulary difference here between Miaphysitism and Diophysitism, but they're trying to express, I think, the same thing. And they are going to take the position that you shouldn't be talking about the two natures, because there's only one nature. And so out of this Miaphysitism, you have groups that emerge that have existed even until today. You have what's sometimes called the Nestorian church, and that's kind of a misnomer. They're not Nestorian in the fullness of Nestorianism, but they like the language that Nestorian uses to a certain degree. And you have, they don't refer to themselves as Eutychians either. I'm just going to skip past this stuff. These tensions are going to be something that comes and goes and flares up and causes a lot of consternation periodically. And Roman emperors are not going to like disunity. They're going to want to keep people unified. And so the West and the East are going to have constant little cracks and constant little schisms that begin to flare up throughout this. One of these, perhaps the first real big schism between the East and the West, is the Acacian Schism. With the rise of Miaphysitism in the East, it really becomes prominent. In the West, Diophysitism still reigns supreme. The Roman emperors are going to try and keep a semblance of unity and try and keep everybody on the same page. You're going to have Emperor Zeno, who rules 474, 475. There's some drama that happens in 475, and he picks back up at 476, 491. He's going to try and ease these tensions through a document that he calls the Henoticon. Heno there, is relating to Henophysitism or Miaphysitism. This is going to be the position that he takes. And what this document's going to do is it's going to condemn, not condemn exactly, but try and replace Chalcedon. And it's going to condemn the Nestorians, but it's also going to condemn the Eutychians. It's going to talk very highly of Cyril of Alexandria, who is, the forefather of this Miaphysitism movement, and it's going to ignore the involvement that Pope Leo had with Chalcedon when Leo really kind of tipped the scales in the Chalcedonian discussions. And so it's going to be this try and take a mediating path that compromises so that everybody can be happy. But like most compromises, nobody's happy. And so it's going to be unsuccessful. The chief bishop for Zeno is a guy, the Bishop of Constantinople, who is closely related to Zeno, named Acacius. He supports Zeno's efforts, and for that, he is excommunicated in 484 by Pope Felix III, because Felix sees Acacius as interfering with Eastern churches. Acacius is trying to, in Felix's mind, he's trying to, go back upon the ecumenical council of Chalcedon. This is ecumenical, meaning kind of universal. This is the council that the whole world, all the churches have kind of signed off to and were involved in. And now Acacius is going against that, and especially among those Eastern churches. And so Felix is going to feel threatened by this, and he is going to really push back against Acacius and excommunicate him. And what a exercise of these newfound papal powers, right? The papacy is at this time, a full-blown papacy with power over all other churches. With the bishop of bishops, to whom all other bishops report, is the See of Rome. And Pope Felix is going to excommunicate the Bishop of Constantinople, the second most significant, influential church in the whole world, and a personal, close relation to the Roman emperor. And so this is going to cause a huge rift between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. That's going to last until Emperor Justinian comes several decades later, about 40 years or so later. This big division between the East and the West. These Miaphysite, Diophysite divisions still exist. And I think this is kind of interesting. You may have heard of people talk about the Jacobite Church. They are perhaps the only group really that accepted the Henoticon, and they still use that as the basis of their faith rather than Chalcedon. You have the one extreme. You have the Armenian Orthodox Church and the Coptic Orthodox churches that still hold to Miaphysitism. Then you have the Church of the East, or the Oriental Orthodox Church, sometimes called the Nestorian Church, that really holds very strongly to that Diaphysitism, even more strongly than the regular Chalcedonians. And so you've got these divisions that emerge and persist even till today, and cracks are beginning to form between the East and the West over these Christological controversies, and it's going to eventually break wide open, and that's where we're going to end the class. Emperor Justinian takes over in 527, and he is in a lot of ways a political rebuilder. If you remember last week, we talked some about what's happened in the western side of the empire. It has not been a good time for the Western Empire. You've had the migration of the Germanic peoples, and it seems like the Germanic people are the arch enemy of the Romans just throughout history. But you've had massive loss of territory in Spain, in North Africa, in Italy itself, in the European regions of the Roman Empire. And so as the Germanic invasion has gone about, the Roman Empire has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. Justinian is going to retake a lot of that land that has been lost. And he is going to re-expand his territory. Also, about this time, I think it's appropriate to stop talking about it as the Roman Empire and start talking about it as the Byzantine Empire. The capital is not Rome anymore. The capital is Constantinople, formerly Byzantium. And so this really kind of, with the Germanic invasions and the Germanic migrations, people mark things differently, but this is really the sign of the end of the Roman Empire. And what's left in the ashes is this Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire. But aside from retaking a lot of those lands, he's going to introduce what's called the Corpus Iuris Civilis, or the body of civil law, and we won't talk about that much, but it's going to be very significant in European law for basically the next several centuries and quite a long time. But he's going to do a lot of those things. He's going to be a builder. He's going to undertake a lot of construction projects and those sorts of things. But he's also going to be a significant religious influence. If you remember, ever since we got all the way back to Emperor Constantine, the Roman emperors are going to be very significant religious influences as well. He is going to see this division between the Miaphysites, the Diophysites, and he is going to really try and preserve unity in what's left of his empire. He's going to be himself a Neo-Chalcedonian, take the Diophysite position. Interestingly, though, his wife is going to be a Miaphysite. And so, tensions at home, I guess. But he is going to really try and find some middle ground here. And so, in an effort to appease these disgruntled Miaphysites, he's going to call the Fifth Ecumenical Council. So we'll look at a list here towards the end of this class, but there's 7 great ecumenical councils. The first 4 are really the most significant. The last 3 are important, but not quite as significant as those first 4. We spent a lot of time with those, so we're going to cover the last 3 today. He's going to call a ecumenical council in Constantinople, and so it's called Constantinople II in 553. And essentially what this is going to do is it's going to condemn 3 significant Antiochian theologians because they were suspected of being Nestorian. And sometimes this is called the 3 chapters. And so a lot similar to the Council of Ephesus, right? The Third Ecumenical Council. Nestorianism is going to be thoroughly condemned. And that very much pleases the Miaphysites because they're very much against Nestorianism, the two natures versus one nature. It's this issue that keeps on coming up. And so that's going to be the main takeaway of Council of Constantinople that's the big takeaway. During Justinian's rule, though, there's going to be quite a few other developments that happen in Christianity. You're going to have the Western Church is going to officially adopt semi-Augustinism. And so we talked a lot last week about Augustine and his positions. He's a bit extreme. And so a moderated version of Augustine's teachings will be adopted as the official position of the Catholic Church. There's the Council of Orange that does that. I think we mentioned that a little bit last week. He's going to be all for the compulsory conversion of these conquered peoples. And so as he expands his empire, lots of people groups that are not Christian are going to be forced to become Christian. During this time, you're going to have expansions of monastic communities. We talked previously about the rise of monasticism. We talked about Benedict of Nyssa and the Benedictine rule for monasticism. This is the time of Benedict. And so Benedict is going to form the Monte Cassino, which you may have heard about. It's this massive, I got a picture of it here in a second, but this massive, massive monastery that exists today, and it's really beautiful. It was it's had a lot of historical significance, including during the world wars and all of that. You're going to have big advancements in art and liturgy and architecture, notably the construction of the Hagia Sophia, which is a massive, massive cathedral in Constantinople. The Hagia Sophia is, when Constantinople falls, I believe it's the 1400s to the Turks, it's going to be converted into a mosque. Some pictures just to kind of get a perspective of what's happened geographically within the empire. This is a map of the Roman-controlled world under Emperor Trajan. This is really the highest extent of the Roman Empire. And you can see that is a massive empire. That's essentially all of Europe, the Middle East, Egypt, North Africa. That's a huge empire. Then you have the time where Constantine comes. You have the Diocletian splits the empire into two halves. And really, we've been talking east to west. And although the empire might not be divided the same way politically with the different rulers between east and west, this is really kind of the division between east and west that we've been talking about. But you can see it has shrunk some in the intervening years, specifically in the east. You got this division. Then you have in 480, this is the aftermath of those Germanic people migrations. And so the empire has lost North Africa, essentially. They've maintained Egypt. Italy was conquered. You might see the term, it's hard to read. It's the name of the Germanic people that settled there in Italy. That there's still influence in Italy, but it's different than it was. But now you get to in 565. You have the Justinian Empire, and he's taken back North Africa, portions of it, significant portions. He's really taken back Italy. He's taken back portions of Spain. And so the empire has grown again. And it's not going to stay this way for long. We'll come back to this map in a little bit with Islam's rise. Briefly, this is Monte Cassino, and this is the monastery constructed by Benedict. It's on the top of a hill. It's this massive, massive facility, really, really pretty. This is the Hagia Sophia, and it's now converted into a mosque, and you can see that by those pillars. Those are later additions, which are very commonly seen on various mosques. But the Hagia Sophia is a massive, massive structure. You can see those, I don't know what you call them, Islamic symbols there that covers over a lot of the Christian iconography that's built into the cathedral. You've got, these just enormous domed ceilings. It's really, really incredible. I've not been. It's open now to the public. It's no longer a functioning mosque. It's a museum now. But when we were in Israel, we got to go to quite a few cathedrals, and it's amazing just the size of these buildings. You look up and you got to really crane your neck. It's kind of mind-boggling how they can build things like this. Briefly, let's make a note about the West, just because this is kind of important. You got Pope Gregory the Great in 590 to 604. He becomes the first monk pope. He is going to bring some of those monastic tendencies into his papacy. He's not a Benedictine monk himself, but Benedictine monasticism is so prevalent that it does influence him. Benedictine monasticism really emphasizes on exactness, very detailed, rigorous schedules. We pray at this time, we eat at this time, we study for this time. It's going to be big on moderation, self-denial, although it's not going to be, so ascetic that it's like, the people that hurt themselves in their denial of the flesh. It's not going to be that extreme. Going to be very orderly, a big focus on balance between worship and, time spent doing spiritual reading, reading the Bible and various other works and physical manual labor and those sorts of things. He's going to take a lot of that into the papacy and really turn the papacy into a much more structured, organized type thing. Notably, he's going to reject the title ecumenical patriarch for himself. Ecumenical means universal. He doesn't like the sound of it, and so he prefers the title servant of the servants of God. And while being a pope, I think that's a pretty noble title, I guess, if you want to give yourself. Pretty humble title, I suppose. He's going to be important because he introduces the concept of 7 deadly sins, which become very, very significant in Catholicism. Pride, covetousness, lust, envy, gluttony, anger, sloth, those things. And he's sometimes credited, although probably not really, probably didn't actually do it, for developing the Gregorian chant. Takes his name, Gregory. Gregorian chant probably comes about a little bit later. But he's going to have some important role in the West. So that brings us to really the division between the Eastern and the Western Church. So that's kind of the history of the East and the West together up until the 600s. Now, really, there's a big divergence. And so we're going to spend the rest of our time today is talking about the Eastern Church exclusively. Next week, we'll talk about the Western Church exclusively. And leading up from the 7th century all the way up to the 11th century when this schism between the two is going to be finalized. A lot of those Christological controversies that we've been talking about, they've impacted the West, but they have been very heavily Eastern in their origins and in the people that have been involved in them. And that's going to be true for the next Christological controversy. So following monophysitism controversy that has been going on, there is going to be the monothelitism controversy. So Emperor Heraclius is going to be trying to find a way to get out of Chalcedon and yet still affirm the two natures but oneness of Christ without using Chalcedonian language. Because again, the Miaphysites really, really don't like Chalcedon. And so the Bishop of Constantinople, again, you have an emperor who has a very close relationship with the Bishop of Constantinople. That's because the empire has moved its capital from Rome to Constantinople. And so Constantinople has a very, very significant place in the church. As a guy, but the bishop is a guy by the name of Sergius, and he speaks of, he finds the oneness not in talk about the nature, Christ has two natures, but in the energy of Christ. And so you might see this called monergism, and then that discussion kind of transitions into discussion about the one will of Christ, monothelitism. This is going to be pretty widely accepted in the East, and a lot of the Eastern people, Eastern Church, will say, "Yeah, this is an acceptable answer for us." but it's going to be rejected in the West. And so the result is yet another schism between the Eastern and Western churches. The divides, the cracks keep forming, and the divides keep growing and growing. And so what you're going to have is the controversy circles around this question. When we talk about the will of Christ, what does that mean? Does the will of Christ pertain to the nature of Christ? If so, then diotheletism is true. Two natures or two wills, because each nature has one will. Therefore, Christ would have a divine will and a human will. Or does the issue of the will pertain to the personhood of Christ? Because if that's the case, then monothelitism is true. Because there's one person, two natures. And so there's this, how do we talk about this? How do we make people happy? How do we stop people from being so divided? So another council's called. And you have then the Third Council of Constantinople in 681 to really try and settle this matter. And the conclusions that they come to is that they condemn monothelitism, but they affirm that the human will submitted to the divine will of the Logos. So they say that the term will pertains not to the personhood, but to the natures. Christ had a human will and a divine will. But how that plays out is that the human will of Christ submits, and the divine will of Christ is the one that controls the body. And so that's the conclusion of the Council of Constantinople. And again, with each of these controversies, you kind of have splinter groups that go off and continue to hold to the losing side. In this case, you have the Syrian church that in Lebanon, sometimes called the Maronite Church, that continues to hold to monothelitism today, although they're a very pretty small group. But this is yet another crack. Here you have the sixth of these ecumenical councils. So moving past that, you begin to have a new kid on the block. So for a long time, you had paganism, you had Christianity. With the merger between the Roman Empire and Christianity, when Christianity becomes mandatory, really paganism really starts to hit the decline. Christianity grows and grows and grows, oftentimes by force. And so we'll talk about this more in a minute, but with that compulsory conversion to Christianity, what it produces is a lot of weak Christians, and a lot of Christians that may be Christians nominally, but not practically. And so come 570, 630, you have the life of Muhammad. Muhammad is a man who marries a very wealthy widow. In 595, she dies. He has quite a few daughters. He works on camel caravans where he probably encountered some Christians. And at some point, according to Islam, Muhammad, who's considered the great prophet, he's the one that is the final say in the revelation process. He receives a revelation from Gabriel, and that revelation is the Qumran. Quran, not Qumran, Quran. And so the Quran then is the holy text of Islam. The term Islam means submission, and the term Muslim means those who submit. He has some respect for Christianity and for Jews. He sees them as people of the book. That's the term he gives them. But he has some very steep disagreements. He doesn't know much about Christianity. He has had some exposure, although not a lot of exposure. For example, in the Quran, there's talk about the Trinity. The idea of the Trinity in the Quran, though, is, I keep saying Qumran, Quran, is not Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Rather, it's Father, Son, Virgin Mary. And so there's some knowledge about Christianity, but not accurate knowledge about Christianity. It seems that from reading the Quran, he's familiar with Christianity mostly in monastic senses and not in a congregational type sense. So he's not very familiar with churches, but he is more familiar with monasteries. And he takes some offense to monasteries and has some problems with those. And so some of the major aspects of Christianity that he has problems with are monasticism, Trinitarianism. Islam is monotheistic. We're monotheistic. Christianity is monotheistic as well. But the monotheism of Islam precludes the Trinity. And so in Islam, there is no Son, there is no Holy Spirit, there's only Allah. And so there's going to be some views about Jesus that are going to be distorted, kind of docetic. I've read, and I'm no expert on Islam by any means, but it seems that the Christianity that Muhammad has had some interactions with may have been influenced by Gnostic groups, perhaps the Ebionites. And so either way, he has a fairly distorted view of Christianity. But Islam is going to really, really grab hold of the world. And it is going to grow and grow very rapidly, and it's a very militaristic religion. And so it's not long before you have vast conquests of Islamic rulers on the world, particularly the Eastern world. And so you have in Jerusalem, 636, Jerusalem's conquered by Islam. In 638, Antioch is conquered. 641, Alexandria is conquered. 687, Carthage is conquered. All of North Africa is conquered by 709. Spain is going to be conquered by 711. And really, the Islamic control of the East is going to stick around for essentially up until current day. And you have, with this Islamic expansion, I think a demonstration of the weakness of a lot of Christians. A lot of Christians are just Christians by name. And so when you have pushback in the faith by means of Islam, rather than stand firm in their faith against this persecution and against this opposition, they just fold. And they say, okay, well, I guess we're going to be Islamic then. I guess we're going to be Muslim then. And I think that's a notable difference from the persecution and opposition that we saw from Christians and the resolve that Christians showed in the first several centuries. When Christianity was illegal and Christianity was not equated to the Roman Empire, persecution was much more prevalent, and I think it resulted in a lot more hardened Christians. They had really been through the crucible, been through the fire, and so their faith had really solidified. But by this time, you have a lot of nominal Christians that have become squishy. And when they face pushback, they easily cave. And so in response to these Islamic expansions that you see, Christians respond in a couple different ways. Some view Islam as just another Christian heresy. There have been lots of these heretical groups that have come around. You've had, think of the, what is it? What Augustine was previously. I'm losing it. That's going to drive me crazy. Well, you have lots of these different little groups that show up from time to time that are schismatic and heretical and kind of become their own little groups and function as a almost competing sect. Manichaeism, that's what I'm just trying to think of. And so there's some that view Islam as just another Christian heresy. Because within Islam, there is some veneration of Jesus and even Mary, although they don't view Jesus as the Christ. They do revere him as a prophet, and so in some ways, some people see this as being related to Christianity and just another heretical offshoot. Some Christians see it as God's judgment on the church because the church has grown weak and they've grown worldly and they have really given into the various practices of the people and those sorts of things. And so perhaps this is God casting judgment upon the church for its weaknesses and shortcomings. Then you have some that say, maybe Islam is a demonic imitation of Christianity. There's some ways in which Islam is kind of parallels and perhaps mirrors Christianity. And so perhaps this is the devil's attempt to form his own religion and outcompete the church. And so Christians respond in various ways to Islam. But from this point on, Islam is going to be a very prevalent force, especially out in the East and Middle East, Africa areas. So we looked at this map just a minute ago. This is the Justinian Byzantine Empire. You're going to have during this time, though, the conquest. And look at just a couple hundred years later, look at how greatly that empire has shrunk. All that purple was controlled by the Byzantines Empire under Justinian. And just a handful of generations later, and it's gone. No control over Africa, no control over the vast majority of the European continent. It's really this tiny little tiny empire. And so the next Christological controversy, next controversy in general, I guess is not perhaps Christological necessarily, is a controversy called iconoclasm. You might see the word icon there. Ikon in Greek is image, and what it means is image breaking. And so you have, from the 2nd century on, 3rd century on, Christian artwork, iconography grows increasingly more popular among the world, the Christian world. Typically, they're scenes that depict, biblical scenes or those sorts of things. What I have as the screen for this whole class has been an example of Byzantine iconography. You have actually in that the depiction of Jesus there and Paul and Peter and the shepherds and those sorts of things. This is going to become the center of a lot of controversy. You have groups that say you should not have these icons because cultic practices have begun to circle around these icons. People are beginning to express devotion to the icons. You've got burning of incense to the image, and you've got they're being draped in like curtains, and little shrines are being made to these images, and it really resembles the idolatry that you sometimes see in the Bible and in pagan cultures. And so there's a group that says, listen, we really do not need to be showing veneration to these icons, these images. In 730, Pope Emperor Leo III is going to issue an edict against the images, and he's going to be counteracted by Pope Gregory III. who's going to support the use of images. And so, again, you got Leo's in the east, Gregory's in the west, some division there, although both the Eastern and Western churches are going to largely support the use of icons. So some arguments are made against the use. They say it's impossible to depict virtue. When you have an image of Jesus, or you have an image of Mary, or you have an image of the disciples, it's impossible to depict the true goodness that they bear. And so what you're doing here is something that's vain. You can't accomplish it, so why are we doing this? They say that the only true image of Jesus is the Eucharist. In the giving of the Lord's Supper, Jesus gives them a demonstration and says, this is my body, this is my blood. It is a demonstration of Jesus. And so that's the true image. Let's not attempt to make others. They'll argue that the early church fathers say it's impossible to have images of Christ. And certainly that is the case. You have strong arguments for the use of images, particularly by a guy named John of Damascus. He's going to say, it is impossible to portray God the Father because God the Father is spirit. And so therefore it would be wrong to portray God the Father. However, Jesus takes on flesh. Mary's a human. Saints are humans. The angels appear as humans at times. And so it's not wrong to depict them because they have physical forms. They had physical forms. And it's not inherently wrong to make images. And they point to things like in the Old Testament, the commandment to make the Ark of the Covenant has 2 cherubim, which had their wings touched to make the mercy seat of God. And so the creation of images in of itself is not inherently wrong. They say that it's lawful to venerate images, and he draws a distinction here. And this is an argument that's going to win the day. He says there's 2 different types of worship. There's true worship, which belongs to God and God alone. But there's also the showing of honor. And you can show honor to others. And the Bible talks about showing honor to whom honor is due. And so there's these different categories of worship. And so you may show God true worship, but you may show icons this second class of worship. May show them honor. And then he'll say, images are useful for teaching, and they're channels of grace. Through the use of images, through the use of iconography, people who may come to understand and know and interpret and visualize biblical truth. I guess they didn't have flannel board back then, and so they got to make mosaics instead of flannel board. But this is going to then culminate in the 7th and final ecumenical council, the Council of Nicaea II in 787. And in the Council of Nicaea II, they're going to reject iconoclasm and say it is not right that you should outright refuse, and even destroy icons in images. They take that argument and they say there is a distinction between honorable reverence, which you can show to the icons, and true devotion, which belongs to God. And they'll also say that images partake in the nature of what is being represented. And so therefore, pictures become God with us in visible form. And so if you have a depiction of Jesus, and you venerate that image of Jesus, what you're doing is not venerating, the image, but rather you're venerating Jesus himself. And that is the argument that's going to win the day. Both Rome and the West, the Western Rome and the Eastern Church are going to agree to this. Although there are going to be some distinctions in the Eastern Church, and you see this even today. Eastern iconography is always two-dimensional. It's paintings or drawings. It's never sculptures. Whereas in the West, you have iconography that's very clearly three-dimensional, very clearly sculptures, crucifixes and statues and those sorts of things that are three-dimensional. And so yet again, even on this topic that they agree on, you have cracks and differences between the East and the West. So just to summarize, there's 7 of these ecumenical councils, and just to kind of think about them: Nicaea, Constantinople; Ephesus, Chalcedon; Constantinople II, Constantinople III, Nicaea II. The first one talks about the oneness, talks about the Arian controversy. The second one talks about the threeness of God, the Apollinarian controversy. Council of Ephesus, the oneness of Christ. Then you have the two-ness of Christ. Then you have the two natures of Christ. Then you have the two wills of Christ. And then you have the use of images of Christ, I guess. And so these are the 7 universal councils that are going to be signed off upon by representatives of both the East and the Western Church. But after Nicaea II, no more. There's been lots of smaller councils that have been localized, but these are the 7 universal ones. So we'll wrap up with this, but from the 9th to the 11th centuries, in the Byzantine Empire, you have a golden age that really emerges. The Islamic threat is not quite as great. Things have settled down to some extent. Byzantine architecture flourishes. Church buildings are built all over the place. You have incredible murals that are created throughout the Byzantine Empire. Monasticism flourishes, and lots of monasteries are constructed. And these are very significant, largely because so much of the Bible, the biblical manuscripts that we have, are Byzantine manuscripts. Sometimes you hear people talk about the majority text, and sometimes people equate the majority text with the Byzantine manuscripts. The reason is that in this time period, you have an enormous number of biblical manuscripts that are produced by Byzantine people, Byzantine monks and whatnot. And so a huge wealth of the biblical manuscripts we have come from this time period. And a lot of Christian literature is copied and preserved. And so, if you think about it, we have a lot of writings from the early church fathers. We have a lot of writings from all of these people we've talked about so far, just about, have all written something. Augustine wrote huge amounts, and you got, Ambrose writes, all these guys are writing stuff. And so these documents need to be produced. It's not like there's just one copy of them floating around in the world. They're being produced en masse and being preserved. You have a lot of missionary activity, and perhaps most notably is great conversions of Slavic people. And so sometimes you think about like the Russian Orthodox Church, or all these different Orthodox churches out in the Eastern Europe and the Slavic areas, Romanian Orthodox Church and all of that. That's going to be largely coming from this time period. You're going to have a guy by the name of Cyril and his brother that are very effective missionaries. I think it's kind of interesting that up until this point, there's not an alphabet for the Slavic languages. And so Cyril is responsible for creating an alphabet. And the alphabet it's been modified, but it's still in use today. And so when you see Russian writing, the Byzantine Empire speaks Greek, obviously. And so when you see Russian alphabet, you see like Greek symbols in there. And why is that? Well, it comes from Cyril. And so the alphabet comes to be known as Cyrillic alphabet. But mass conversions of the Slavic peoples, when you have these Eastern mission churches, they tend to organize around national ethnic lines, and so what you end up with is a church that's there's a term, I can't quite remember it off the top of my head. It's like Kephalic or something. The idea is basically a federation of autonomous churches that hold the same doctrine. And that's different than how the Eastern or the Western Church is going to go about mission work. When the Catholic Church evangelizes and builds churches, they insist on uniformity, to the uniformity of the Latin Mass, to the Latin rites and all those. The Western Church, Eastern Church, how many times can I mess that up? The Eastern Church is going to be much more comfortable with differences, customary differences between these congregations. They go as far as China. They follow the Silk Road to China. There's evidence that in 980 there's some persecution that breaks out in China and appears to have essentially killed out the church in China. They spread to Mongolia, and several Mongol tribes become heavily Christian. They spread to Korea. They spread to Kyoto, Japan. Pretty interesting, and you can see some evidence of those churches that still exist today. But after this, we've covered a lot of material. When the 6th century comes to a close, really, although it has not been formalized, the Eastern and Western churches are rapidly growing apart from one another. And there's cracks and schisms, and we haven't even mentioned all of them, that are rising and being tamped down, but they just can't keep all the cracks covered. And so what we're going to do next week, we're going to wrap up this whole series, and we're going to talk about the Western church from this time frame. And then we're going to talk about the great schism that results, and we'll wrap it all up there. Thank you guys for watching. Appreciate the attention. I know this has been some dense material, and it's kind of been confusing and hard to get through at times. But I appreciate you guys for sticking with me. Next week, we'll give this all a wrap up. Thanks.